Well, you're all very welcome.
In the opening session, you heard that you had to test the Czech beer. I did it yesterday, so I confirm it's pretty good. So I'm Thierry Mars. I'm radio director at EGTA. For those who do not know EGTA, EGTA is the Association of TV and Radio Sales Houses. So we represent 170 members across 45 markets.
Okay, wow, that's pretty big.
Yes,
pretty
it
big.
is.
Sarah, will you introduce yourself for us?
I am Sarah Van Mosel. I am currently a strategic advisor for iHeart Media in the US. Prior to that, I was Chief Revenue Officer at Stitcher, which was acquired by SiriusXM and Pandora. Prior to that, I was at Market Ingenuity, which was the sales arm of podcast networks such as Radiotopia, TED Talks, The Moth, who's also here at this organization today. And I started my journey, I was at Acast in the US, started off their sales team there, and started my podcast journey at New York Public Radio. And super happy to be here to talk all about it. Yeah.
Really interesting background. I suppose we're looking at, we're going to be talking a lot about America and North America and the situation there. But Thierry, you have the European perspective at the moment. So maybe you could, let's start here and see where we go.
And I have a slide for that.
Perfect.
With a few numbers.
Our clicker is not clicking.
We need a click. Please. Oh, teething problems.
No worries.
Teething problems. For anybody who was with me in the Youth Summit, you'll know all about it. We'll get there. But maybe just Thierry, while we're waiting for the slide to come through, I suppose you have a broad view of Europe and how things are going.
Yes. So we will see later the numbers, but it's obvious that podcast is growing in Europe. With some variations between the markets, but on average we see an increase of unique listeners across all the markets.
Yeah.
As you will see later, about 10% year-on-year increase. We can say that there are now 50% more unique listeners than in 2019.
Yeah. So there's a strong growth then, and I mean we heard it in the opening session that it's. Audio is stronger than technology, I think, at the moment.
Probably, yes. And I think that's also related to the fact that there are more and more podcasts.
Okay.
We can say that no podcast is no more for just one kind of people, the elites, but it's more for everyone. So there's a podcast for everyone nowadays.
Yeah. That is certainly something that people who are at the podcasting summit would have heard yesterday, that the quality and the choice is massive, and sometimes as a creator it's hard to break through that. But if that's the situation in Europe, have we got a slide? No.
What you can also say is that Europeans are also listening more and more, so longer.
Yeah.
So in 2022 they were listening about 22 minutes a day for the podcast, and there is an increase of 11% expected for 2023.
Wow.
So it is.
So it's continuing.
Continuing, indeed. So.
Okay. And then in I'm sure you probably would.
But we were talking about spending money.
Yes.
Also. So we can also say that the ad spend has increased about 5 times since 2019. So that's quite a huge increase.
5 times since 2019.
Times, yes. And there is a 35% increase expected for this year versus last year. And it should triple by 2027. Sorry.
By 2027, ad spend in Europe, you're predicting it will treble. Wow. What kind of numbers are you looking at there?
Sorry?
Do you have numbers? On your slide.
On the slide, yes, but I think.
Okay. And then in North America, then what is the situation, Sarah?
So podcasting since probably 2017 or 2015 is when they started measuring podcast in earnest on the revenue side. That was a joint survey between PwC and the IAB over there.
Okay.
And I think we started out at 17 million back then. We're slated to hit, I think it's 2.4 billion by 2025. Wow. So it's, when you talk hockey stick growth in terms of revenue and listening in the US, it's really substantial. I think the pandemic really gave us an additional bump. It's kind of leveled off a little bit since 2021 in terms of listening, where there was a peak year, but that hasn't slowed down the revenue at all. We have roughly, I think it's 120 million people a month in the US listening to podcasts.
Wow.
Which is a lot. That's over a third of the US population listening to podcasts in the US, which is huge. And it's becoming more and more mainstream. The thing is, podcasting started as a bit of a niche medium. It was really hard to get before the podcast app with the iPhone. It was essentially, find an MP3 player, download this
Not user-friendly.
No, and for Americans, again, you're going to have you have to serve it up to us on a McDonald's tray to make it easy for everybody. But essentially, it was only a hardcore subset of people that really sought out podcasts to listen to. And they tended to be public radio listeners. So this is NPR, this is New York Public Radio. Here we go, here's some numbers. But it also tended to be, here's theory slide. It tended to be, just niche folks, indie folks. So the whole industry in the US really started with the indie creators and not so much with commercial players. And so it really has led to the story of how the revenue has evolved as well. But we can revisit this slide if you wanted to.
We've had a quick look here, Thierry. Is there anything you want to say about, the Northern Europe? Maybe, are you good to move on? You're good. Okay. So the stats that you have here are pretty impressive.
Exactly. And as you can see in this graph, we had a little retraction in 2022. That was basically post-pandemic behavior. People started, going back to their commutes and going back to leaving the house. Interestingly enough, podcast listening, the most, the activities that people engage in the most in the US when listening to podcasts is stuff around the house, housework, walking their dog, cooking. It's all in-house stuff, which is really interesting when you consider, it's still an in-ear experience. But, and then weekly listening is around 89 million. So it's 31% of the population. It's huge. It's huge. And it's growing. And
it's so much easier now.
Exactly.
And there has been a real evolution kind of in the last 10 years.
Oh, yes.
And are there kind of key points that you think are really important in terms of, I suppose, reach, usability, and also revenue?
Yes. I think the big story with the growth and reach has been really the iPhone. Most podcast listening, still between 60 and 70% of all podcast listening in the US is on iPhones, which is a very interesting phenomenon. Also, as it started to expand into other platforms, particularly YouTube, you're starting to see different kinds of people coming to the podcast table with different expectations, not just looking for their same sort of OG podcast that you would find in the podcast app, but more influencer audio that they are finding everywhere, and the lines are starting to get a little bit blurred as well.
Okay.
And again, I've referenced this, 4.2 billion is the estimation for revenue in the US for podcast ad spend by 2024. It's huge growth, and this is as a result of market consolidation. We'll talk about some of the key milestones that have driven the real accelerated growth here. It's also ad tech.
Okay.
It's also the big 3 or 4 companies in the US being Spotify, iHeart, SXM Media, and Amazon buying the full tech stack to be able to feed the beast, so to speak.
Yeah, you're really looking at economies of scale there.
Exactly, exactly. And so now you have organizations that not only own the rails, but also the trains. And in America, that's a little, but that's how it goes. And so it's made it so that we're evolving to a place where the largest holding companies, the ad agencies in the US, are for the first time feeling a lot more comfortable leaning into programmatic, for example, buying audiences and not just safe individual shows. And we'll talk more about brand safety as we go ahead as well.
So this is really the last 10 years, and it's acceleration, really, isn't it?
Exactly. I feel like this slide is really like what I personally have been doing for the last 13 years. So essentially, these peak moments in podcast history in the US are the things that have gotten us to where we are today. They were the essential building blocks in driving podcast revenue growth to 4.2 million for 2024. So initially, like I said, it started with indies, it started with public radio. I personally joined WNYC because I loved Radiolab. Radiolab was this show that was so amazing, it was mind-blowing.
Yeah.
I just wanted to participate in them living to create another day. Like, my whole orientation has always been, how can I help the creator generate revenue so that they can create more content?
And that's how you feel good
And
about making
exactly,
money. There you go.
That's
there
the
you
orientation. And so when you're funding creators that are putting good things into the world, you get as innovative as you can because they have a finite amount of time and resources.
Yeah.
And so one of the ways that we helped Radiolab get from point A in revenue to point B, even in public media, was to unlock dynamic ad insertion for them. They had around probably 6 million monthly downloads back in 2011. They were one of the biggest shows in the US back then.
Yeah.
But without the ability to insert ads, we literally were giving away, we were baking in ads, so essentially producing in the underwriting spots where this show is brought to you by so-and-so, and then a tagline, because that's how we do it in public radio in the US. But they got everything for that episode, Forever and Ever Amen, and that felt like it was giving away a little bit too much. So we worked with our tech team. Dan Jeselson was my right-hand man on the project, and he's now the Chief Technical Officer at Art19, which was acquired by Amazon not too long ago. And so we worked with AdsWiz, which was also acquired by SXM Media. So all of these players were independent back in 2011.
Yeah.
And so we at WNYC worked with them to figure out how to, you would think, why is this so hard? It's not brain surgery. You would just, like, at a certain point, put an ad break in or put a marker.
Yeah.
Not so much, because in podcasting, we're not playing to a clock, right?
Yeah, of course.
They need to be able to tell the story in their own time. They need to be able to break when the story allows and not have it be at 15 minutes in and at 30 minutes in, because that felt invasive in the storytelling. So we figured out how to drop an ad tag in wherever the producer felt that break should be, as long as there were pre-rolls, mid-rolls that were roughly after 25% and before 75% of the way through, and then post-rolls.
Yeah.
And so essentially those tags would pull in an ad that would deliver impressions across all listening in that time period, not just that episode, not just that moment in time, but all listening. And because Radiolab, it's a perfect example, it's an evergreen show. Like, you can listen to episodes from 5 years ago today and it's still relevant. So it really changed the way we did the math when it came to how much inventory is available. It wasn't simply how many downloads did this episode get, it was what is all the active listening that's happening from this date to this date. And that change really just opened up a whole world of opportunity in terms of revenue, because you were no longer giving away 6 million downloads per episode. Now all of a sudden you had 13 million impressions that you could sell, not just to one person who probably couldn't have, that's expensive if you're buying it all. Now you could chop it up into smaller segments and really open up opportunities for lots of different advertisers. So, and I won't go into that level of depth, but shortly thereafter, we realized that we all had to be singing from the same hymn book, so to speak, and to get together with the IAB in the US and start a podcast-specific working group. It was very different from a streaming working group. Streaming audio was already well established. They had their best practices around measurement and counting impressions. Podcasts didn't. It was the wild, wild west. And so this was as recently as 2013, so that was 10 years ago. It feels like just yesterday. But that was when we really sat down as an industry, all came to the table and said, how are we counting downloads? How are we advising those who are buying ads to measure the same way across all shows? That led to our first upfront, meaning the industry presenting their wares to the advertising community, which allowed everyone to sort of showcase the new content that was coming out. That became an annual thing, which is normal in the US for any sort of mainstream medium. And then, of course, we had the IAB PwC podcast revenue report, which published benchmarks of ad spending in the industry.
And we'll be talking about that later.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And then, of course, in 2019, the industry started to consolidate. Spotify bought Gimlet, and that started the whole domino effect of money frenzy in the US around content, like to the point that we're seeing a little bit of a contraction now as a result of all of the spend that was happening between 2019 and today. And so because, again, you had these companies like Spotify, like iHeart, like SiriusXM, and even Amazon buying the tech stack as well as the content. So they had ad tech, they had hosting and distribution, they had content, and then they had major sales teams that had, direct relationships with all the holding companies. You were able to really set forth the series of events that enabled programmatic to begin. Because in the US, programmatic for podcasting wasn't there at the beginning. It was all baked in. And then, of course, we get to where we are today, which is trying to figure out how to do brand safety in this brave new world.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah.
In terms of marketplace, I think we can say that in Europe it's quite complex right now in terms of monetization, platforms, and measurements. Mm-hmm. So national rankers exist in countries like Germany, France, and the Nordics. But there is no comprehensive total audio measurement, including podcasts, in place. Mm-hmm. So I would like to ask you, given that the US market is a much more mature market, could you please give us the recipe, the secret ingredients to make it work?
To making measurement work and making everything. The money.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the first thing that helped it happen was to come to consensus across the industry on how we were measuring downloads. Downloads were the currency, still are the currency, because in the US, it is an open podcast ecosystem, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in detail. But what that means is every creator, every publisher distributes their content widely across any app where you can listen to podcasts. There are a couple of exceptions. Spotify in particular took an exclusive strategy, which they're opening up a little bit now. But for the most part, in the US, if you like a show, like Radiolab, for example, you can hear it anywhere you listen to podcasts. Now, that's great, but remember, Apple had 60 to 70% of the market listening on their podcast app. Apple does not return the data flow back to the publisher around whether an ad was heard or not. So when you distribute your show with ads included out and someone listens to it in the Apple Podcast app, you have no idea whether or not they heard the app. There's no way to confirm. You can tell how long they listened to the show, and you can assume that if your ad marker is 25% of the way through, that the chances are that they heard that ad. But it's unlike streaming, where you know exactly what's going on with the ads, and unlike any other digital media, in podcasting, it's still a little quasi-digital that way. So we had to come to consensus on how are we going to count it, what are we going to transact on. Our currency is downloads. Let's all agree. Let's all count that way. Mm-hmm. And as soon as that happened and everyone sort of aligned themselves there, the floodgates opened, because every advertiser had heard how effective this medium is, and the reasons why we can talk about as we get a little closer, but it was so effective. To have a host read an ad in their podcast and to sort of share that glow, that halo of credibility from the creator to the audience that kind of went through a lot of trouble to find that podcast in the first place and put it in their playlist. It's not passive listening. It's 100% lean in, chosen listening, to then have that host be able to speak to a product that they did actually experience and enjoy. Huge results. So once the word got out that it was so effective, advertisers just really needed to, how do I get it? How do I get it? And even to this day, it's a little challenging for advertisers to figure out what's the entry point to getting the shows that I want, because shows can change affiliation so quickly. And as you can see this slide in front of me, this is the audio landscape in the US. Look at how crazy this is, right? So from the green side, where that's the marketer, so you're the advertiser and you want to, like, who's in that space, and how does it get all the way over to the blue side, which is how do people actually listen to the end product and hear the ad? It's nuts. There's agencies, ad creation, there's rep firms, there's data measurement analytics. There's
busy.
So much going on here.
It's
and this
so
is
busy.
all of audio. And this is podcasting. This is the subset of the slide before. And this has gotten, you know, with consolidation, a lot of these entities have become, you know, acquired by some of the bigger ones, but there's still a lot going on. And because things are getting more streamlined, it doesn't mean that innovation is slowing down. It's almost the best time ever to be an independent creator in the US because of this consolidation. Any platform that you go on is going to have the ad pipes plugged right in from those major companies, from an iHeart, from a Megaphone, Spotify Span, Spotify Ad Network, SXM Media. They're all going to plug their pipes into RSS.com, Spreaker, any of these sort of smaller indie platforms, and you as a creator can benefit from
that.
The programmatic ads.
We're about halfway through our presentation, but I wanted to ask you about digital audio spend. So it's streaming and podcasting in the US.
Yes.
It's nearly caught up to spend for broadcast, right?
Exactly. And this slide that I'm showing here is like, it's creeping up on 50-50 spend right now, which is, nobody thought that that would be the case.
No, because that's additional spend. It's not cannibalizing what's already being spent.
Exactly.
Which is
if anything,
happy-making.
The money is coming from linear television.
Wow.
And moving into digital.
I feel good
audio.
about that.
Yeah. Bring it on. It's because you can actually prove that it's working.
Yeah.
It's just, you know, old habits die hard in the US, and what makes things move is proof that it works. Measurement, right? Being able to show I spent X, I got Y, I can justify spending X times 2 now.
Yeah. And it's very measurable.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Exactly. And, you know, if you wanted to get a sense of, you know, what it costs to buy this medium in the US, right?
Yeah.
This graph essentially gives you a sense of the CPMs based on the size of show. So the math
The size
here,
of show.
The size of the show.
Okay.
Exactly. So 100,000 downloads plus means you probably have a lower CPM. You would think, oh, a big show, it's going to, you know, garner much higher CPMs. If you're doing dynamic ad insertion, it's not necessarily the case because, you know, How Stuff Works, for example, has something like 36 million downloads a month. It's rarely 100% sold, so unless there's pressure on that inventory, which would drive the rates up, you're going to have a little bit lower rates. Whereas the sweet spot, which is 10,000 to about 100,000 downloads, that's, you know, key. Even to like 10,000, most shows are 10,000 downloads or less that you can sort of find out there in the world.
Okay.
And so you're going to have a higher CPM on a smaller show just because there's more pressure on the inventory and it sells out faster.
Wow. Talk about direct rates. They kind of grew out of necessity in the US, didn't they?
Yes.
What's that like? What's that working out like?
Sure. So the direct rates came as a result of direct response advertising, right? And so as we talked about a little bit in the beginning, in order to get your ads in, you basically just had the host read the ad and they were produced into the episode and they were there forever and ever, amen. And you would do a sort of back of the envelope calculation based on how many downloads you had and how much pressure. And it sort of found itself right around $25 CPM. Okay. And then from there, which buyers thought was crazy, like, oh, this is digital, it should be single digit, what are you talking about? No. Because traditionally there's not a talent fee associated with it, so it's all built in. But we sort of landed in the US on direct to the show because the host is reading it, about a $27 CPM. And as you can see here, in the context of what, right? So the Super Bowl, if you do the math, how much do you pay for an ad in the Super Bowl? How many impressions do you get as a result? it's only a little bit more expensive than podcasts on an impression by impression basis.
Yeah.
How effective is it? I mean, the jury's out on that. People talk about the ads, but do they move cars?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But this is just a comparison so that you can get a sense of where podcast falls. The word on the street is it's a little expensive, but it's also extremely effective.
Well, that is what you want to hear. But if you're kind of doing a deeper dive into direct response,
yes,
that's what you want to talk about, really, isn't it?
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And as you can see here in this slide, this is data from the IAB PwC, that's PricewaterhouseCoopers podcast revenue study. They update it every year. It comes out in May. And pretty steadily, like a lot has changed. Consolidation started in 2019, so that's when Spotify bought Gimlet.
Okay.
In 2021, the 2022 report will come out next month. It's still half of the revenue is from direct response, and this means that it's those brands that you know and love, like Casper Mattresses, MailChimp, HelloFresh. These are direct-to-consumer brands that reach out directly to the shows, have the shows read the ads in their own voice with an endorsement, preferably, not all the time, but those direct response dollars built the U.S. podcast industry, particularly the revenue. And so it's hard work because they need to see a result based on the money that they spend. We have some calculation metrics coming up, but it's still driving over half of the podcast revenue in the U.S.
Just a quick question. Where does the money for podcast come from? Does it come from digital pockets?
It's a good question. Initially, I think it started, so agencies had radio. Radio changed to audio when streaming came along. Podcast, there was a bit of a knife fight in the U.S. about who was going to own podcasts. The digital teams wanted to own podcasts, but the audio teams ended up taking it. So it tends to be audio are the holding companies, departments, the spenders, the buyers consider themselves audio, and they are often pulling it in terms of the brand overall planning from television, like linear broadcast television. That said, you're starting to see it move into a sphere called influencer marketing.
Oh, yeah. We know the influencers.
You know influence marketing?
Yeah.
A little thing called TikTok. We're getting a little heated in the
Yeah.
U.S. about that these days.
Everybody's getting heated about TikTok.
Exactly. So podcasts, because it is, in many cases, not all cases, but in many cases, it's another form of influencer marketing. The lines are blurring between social media and podcasting now because direct response sees them both the same way. So the direct response agencies, which are specialized agencies in the U.S., often have teams that focus on YouTube and podcast and streaming. And so they'll go back and forth between those because it's influencer marketing at the end of the day.
Okay.
Oh, I stopped clicking. Sorry, guys.
Oh, no. Oh, no.
That's all right.
Did you want to talk about best practices theory?
Not really. No, we can say that in Europe there are also a lot of, we see that there's a trend that D2C brands are investing more and more in radio. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering, but I think you already answered it, that are they also doing that in the States, in the podcast? And
Totally.
Yes.
Totally. And as you can see, the kinds of ads that are driving the revenue, when you see the majority is still host-read ads, that's an indicator that the direct response dollars are driving that as well. So the way this breaks out is host-read ads are literally that. Then you can have announcer-read ads or pre-produced ads, which are either voice of network, meaning the network has a designated person that's set aside to go ahead and read them, or it comes from pre-produced ads from the advertiser that come in. And then the small segment is sort of repurposing streaming audio ads, which sound a little bit different, or radio ads, which is kind of a big no-no in the US. We're really putting pressure on creative agencies to step up their game on the audio side and come out with some really cool things. I've noticed the big companies like iHeart and SXM and Spotify all have in-house creative agencies that try to do really fun things like 3D audio, where they're taking you on a journey and really doing some fun stuff there that they'll customize for the client.
Yeah.
Oh, we need more clicker assistance, folks. Okay. And again, this is just a little joke, but if you heard about cereal in the U.S., one of their MailChimp ads. MailChimp is an email
Yes.
marketing
Service,
tool. Exactly. And the kid in the spot called it MailKimp, and it was funny, and it sort of stayed in the vernacular. And so, if it's, you're a podcast listener if MailKimp sort of resonates.
There you go.
And that was a classic example of direct response advertising, which these brands are as well. And really, the math is, the amount that you spend divided by the number of conversions, whether that be someone buying your product or service, going to your website, whatever the KPI is, key performance indicator, gives you a cost per acquisition. So that number, every marketer has that number in their head, and they will spend till the cows come home, as long as their cost per acquisition target is met. The moment that the cost is higher than what they're spending, or they're not getting back more than they're spending, they cut it off completely.
We're done.
And they
That's
all
it.
have cancellation clauses in their contracts so that they can do that, so they're not stuck in a year-long contract when they're losing money. They need to be nimble, and as such, the publishers have to kind of go with the flow.
Be able to be flexible.
It's true, and as much as I personally love the direct response, world, they're like locusts. They come in, they eat a field clean. Everyone who listens to your show that wants to buy a mattress is going to get a mattress. And then when everybody has a mattress, they've got to move on to the next show. And that field is
empty
left.
now. Yeah,
exactly.
And we're done.
Unless you have a regular influx of new listeners in a show, which is also a measurable thing, which means the spender will probably decrease their spend just enough to keep reaching those new listeners. They're constantly on the hunt for new ears.
Locusts is a good metaphor.
Exactly.
So I guess that the cost per acquisition is quite low for D2C brands?
It depends. Honestly, it depends. So you could have a product or service which costs the consumer, I don't know, $10. You can have something like the meal delivery kits, which are $30 a week. They'll spend in the right proportion to keep getting people to do that. Then you can have higher priced things like a mattress, which is, can be $1,000. You can have, even all brands in the U.S. need to show return on investment. So essentially everything is direct response. But there are some that have elements of branding, which is more when you're in that sales funnel, that you're thinking about particular brands ahead of other brands, and they're willing to invest in the long haul of getting those brands in your head. But essentially, when they come down the funnel, they're going to need to see return.
I'd just like to kind of move towards, I suppose, just talking really briefly about the shift in the kind of the US podcast I suppose, system.
Yes.
It's more open now. There's been a kind of an evolution.
Yes.
And I think that isn't happening in Europe currently.
Yes.
It might. But if you could just talk, we've about 7 or 8 minutes left.
Sure.
So we'll just take a run at that one.
Could we go forward one? There we go. So this is interesting. As you may know, we talked a little bit about the U.S. podcast industry tends to be an open podcast ecosystem, meaning your show is available anywhere anyone wants to listen. Spotify kind of bucked that trend in the US when they brought Joe Rogan in exclusively to Spotify. Very smart strategy. They were trying to drive young men to subscribe to podcasts on Spotify, and it worked. Now, The Verge, which is a publication in the US, did a little number crunching based on Twitter followers of Joe Rogan, and they came to the conclusion that going exclusive is actually bad for the creator, because they noted a marked decrease in new Twitter followers to Joe Rogan, and there could be a number of reasons why that is. But what they
quite a few. I don't feel sorry for him, I have to say.
The conclusion that they drew was that going exclusive reduces your audience, and it is a risk for the creator. And I think in the time that Joe Rogan went exclusive with Spotify, I think the headlines were they paid him $100 million or something to go exclusive. Now, he has a huge enterprise. I think he's personally responsible for the drive toward YouTube, because he has ticked up his YouTube presence, which a lot of podcasters have. If you're doing a chat show and you're in the studio anyway, just throw some cameras up and you can double your revenue. You can get more revenue from the same amount of work, which is the dream for all podcast creators. But this open podcast ecosystem, it was frustrating for some. I think Spotify has pivoted on some of the exclusive deals that they've done and opened them up a little bit wider. I think the Obama deal moved to another entity because they just wanted a broader audience. It might work for a Joe Rogan for a while, but for others, when we saw that move toward exclusivity on particular platforms, they realized, sadly, that they gave up more than they got. While they may have gotten a big one-time check to do that, what they gave up was their relationship with a much wider audience and their ability to control that growth over time. There's a next slide here that's a pie chart. So to give you a sense of the US, like what does this open podcast ecosystem look like? The folks at Freakonomics Radio, who I love, they started at WNYC and they're now at SXM Media. Great folks. You should listen to the show if you've never picked it up. It's about the hidden side of everything. He was a New York Times columnist for a while. But this chart gives you a sense of his 8.7 monthly downloads. These are all the platforms that it's consumed on. So if he decided to go exclusive to Stitcher, for example, right, he would only have 500,000 downloads. That's the orange slice in the pie. Now, it may grow. He may, but you'd have to then pay for promotion on all of these other platforms to drive them to this one platform. The nice thing about an open podcast ecosystem, and particularly in a world where Apple makes up 60 to 70% of all of your listening, right, is that you can use that open podcast ecosystem to drive bigger audience because you can include in your own show promos about listen to us on Spotify or wherever you listen to podcasts. Because people have their habits and they choose, and sometimes they switch, although not often. But this is what you'd be missing out on. If Freakonomics were only exclusive in Spotify, they'd only have 1 million downloads and maybe more because Spotify would promote it internally. Maybe they'd double that. Maybe they would triple it, but it would still be way less than the 8.7 they experienced by being in the open podcast ecosystem. And the same goes for ads. So interestingly, subscription has not quite taken off in the US in a way that would enable us to let the advertising part of the revenue equation go. Advertising is king in the US podcast industry. So that also boosts the whole idea that you should put your content everywhere because the larger your audience, the more impressions you have, the more revenue you can generate.
Okay. Sarah, I saw in a previous slide of yours on the timeline, 2022 was the year of brand safety. So I know that some American tech companies are developing some brand safety solutions, offering brand safety context, but also targeting. Could you tell us more about it?
Sure.
And are advertisers ready to pay more for this kind of brand safety?
Never. No. So brand safety is emerging. It's all anyone's talking about in the U.S. podcast market right now because programmatic is taking off because we have the ability to target audiences across lots of different shows. You don't even have to worry about the title. If you want women 18 to 34, you can find them, and regardless of what show it is. Now, because the U.S. podcast industry didn't launch on content that was in any way regulated, so you have Joe Rogan, you have like anyone who is a comedian, you have lots of folks who may have women 18 to 34 listening to them. You as a brand may have your brand on that show, and you may not feel great about it. So until very recently, we didn't have the ability to, we'd have to group shows. We'd have to just sort of tag shows as acceptable or not acceptable on a per brand basis. And now there's a new sort of wave of technology. Sounder.fm is one of the players in this space that is using IAB standards and also GARM standards, which as a sort of measuring stick for what is and is not brand safe. And they can essentially score they can transcribe and score every episode, every podcast episode, and give it a rating so that you know whether or not your content should appear in that show. Now, the publishers are a little nervous because that means you're essentially reducing the universe of shows that brands can run on. The way iHeart was looking at it, which I thought was pretty smart, was first they integrated the technology into their distribution platform, so you know before you even start a campaign if it's going to run, it's only going to run on safe content because it comes right from the distribution platform. But the second thing is, now you can go into genres that you never would have gone in before, right? Instead of closing, it's opening, because would you ever run in true crime before? What if the true crime was about stealing balloons at children's birthday parties? There's nothing unbrand safe about that. That's totally fine. Yeah. So now all of a sudden you're running your ad in a show, getting new ears where you couldn't have gotten them before, which I think is pretty clever. So it's very, very early days for it actually rolling out in the US, but those are some of the issues that people are thinking about when they consider brand safety.
In your opinion, do you think that it will help grow the podcast industry?
I do. I absolutely do. Because those brands and planning teams at holding companies who were maybe a little bit more conservative or a little bit less comfortable with the unknown now have a way to show that their campaigns are running across shows that are okay, and they've tested it and it's fine. So I think we're going to see even more programmatic, for example, just unleashed on podcasting in the US.
Yeah. I think it will come here too as well.
Yeah.
I think it will be important. Look, my alarm went off. You all heard the cheesy music I wake up to every morning. But we have a few minutes, and I would like to get some questions if there are any from the audience. But I suppose it would be nice to just look to the future.
Yes.
And see maybe what you think is going to be important.
Totally. So in the US in particular, these are some of the things that we're seeing, these evolutions. There's a huge push for audio companions to streaming video series, because streaming video is enormous in the US, so you're seeing these companions come out at the same time. Gaming and the metaverse. I personally am involved in a gaming startup. It's in stealth mode right now, but follow me on LinkedIn if you want to. Exactly. Because there are lots of really fun ways to engage even further with new audiences in a fun way in the audio space. Video podcasts. This is that move toward YouTube that we're seeing, that Joe Rogan really championed in the US. And then, of course, synthetic voice, AI voice. There's all kinds of fun. Yeah,
and there's going to be a lot of chat about that, I think, in various different sessions.
Yes.
But look, I suppose the thing is, we did want to. I think we've talked a lot about revenue, and making you feel good, I suppose, it's kind of coming back to that idea of being able to sustain an industry.
Exactly.
And being able to grow an industry and attract new people in and pay people properly, whether they're creators or technicians or sales reps, whoever it is. I just want to thank you very much for your contribution, and thank you, Thierry, as well.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for listening to us and staying. Does anybody have a question? Okay, over here in the second row. I think we have time for maybe just the one.
Make it good.
Hello, thank you.
No, kidding.
It's possible to go back to the chart on the ADV market, please, because I have one question about.
We may not be able to.
Okay.
Oh,
this one?
No, the one with the 4 billion is on.
It's way back. I'd say just ask the question.
Okay, the question is, how many of this money go really to the creators? And how many of them go to the platform? Because in my opinion, it's like YouTube.
Yes.
I mean, everyone is on YouTube, but Google make the money.
Yes.
Okay.
Right. So the way that the revenue breaks out for creators depends on the relationship that they have with their distributor. In some cases, the creators are employees of the company. iHeart has employees that are podcast producers, as does Spotify, as does SXM Media. And so, they're employees and their job is to make content, and they get, whatever salary that they get and whatever participation in profits that they get based on that company. If you're an independent and you have a representation agreement with one of these folks, again, there are degrees of relationship that you can have. If your partner is helping with production, there's one percentage. Maybe it's a 50-50, right? If your partner is only doing ad sales, maybe it's a 70-30, 70% to the creator, 30% to the representation. It's, you'll push the extremes based on how much people want that entity. In the last few years, I've seen some bloody bidding wars for content where that percentage to the creator gets higher and higher just because the sales rep knows that it'll sell, knows that it'll drive revenue, knows that it'll drive revenue across other shows, not just that one. So maybe they're willing to take a smaller percentage from that show in order to get more to go to the rest of their network. So to answer your question, it depends on the relationship with the representation or the partner and how much work each partner is doing. But roughly 50-50 if it's a co-production, and as much as like 80-20 I've seen for the podcast to the creator versus the rep firm. Does that make sense?